I am really excited about this class today. Let me get a little light on the situation. I want to tell you what to expect. So in the first 20 minutes or so, I would like to sort of give you a kind of theological gloss on Martin Luther King Jr.'s project, and to provide some larger historical context within which we will, in the second half of our sort of more formal time today, look directly at the Montgomery Bus Boycott as, a case study, if you will, in lived theology, but also as an event and a historical moment that was not only the awakening of the civil rights movement in the South and the first sort of major event and what would become this great, some might say third great awakening, some might say this Pentecostal awakening, and others, the Black freedom movement that would sweep across the South and the nation in the next 10 to 12 years. We'll look at Montgomery as a place where we can find what we might simply call the foundations of King's theological imagination, which I think remain kind of the elements in his both in his pastorate, in his organizing, in his visionary leadership, as well as in his theological imaginary, as they say, over the years of his life, which is in some way to contradict arguments that I may have made 20 years ago, that other scholars have made, that there are, if not clear, there are nonetheless, inescapable moments of diversion and reconsideration in, if not thematic breaks in King's theological imagination. And I want to simply look at Montgomery as a place that shows us the formation of his theological imagination in this particularly tumultuous historical moment that I think now, after reading King and discussing King and pondering King for years, seems to me not only descriptive of this 382-day protest, but of his how does one place King as a theologian, his evangelical liberalism, his liberal evangelicalism, his kind of neo-orthodox social gospel theology. We can worry about appellations later, but let me just begin first with some general comments. I'm going to turn a little more light on, give me 1 second, please. So in Montgomery, and it's been a real joy to be able to rethink some of these documents and the writings in this volume. Which some of you may have purchased from University of California Press. It's volume 3 of the Martin Luther King papers. It's called The Birth of the New Age, from December 1955 to December 1956. It reads, I would say, like letters and papers from Montgomery. And I would like to hear the resonances of that in light of Bonhoeffer as we move forward. In Montgomery, King had a vision of an emerging new possibility of human social relation, of human sociality. And he would call this and name this the beloved community. If you look with me briefly at the last important document in our reading for today, a document called Facing the Challenge of a New Age, address delivered at the first annual Institute on Nonviolence and Social Change. Do you see that in front of you? This is page 451 from the volume 3. And if we look at this document, page 458 is where I'm looking at this particular paragraph. We find this to be not only celebratory, a celebratory address given just the days after the U.S. Supreme Court rules in favor of the Montgomery Improvement Association in their, again, 382-day boycott, or one might say their 382-day exercise in the spiritual discipline of a selective buying campaign, in this instance, tickets on Montgomery bus lines, but nonetheless ascetic insofar as there is this deliberate kind of spiritual discipline that accompanies the Montgomery church, Black church people as they walk instead of take the bus through wintry streets at the beginning of the protest to work. And we find King not only offering this sort of these words of celebration, but also to the spiritual vision of the emerging Black freedom movement. The Montgomery movement was not called the Civil Rights Movement. Campaigns would not be labeled under such until a year or two following. King referred to the Montgomery story as a spiritual movement. He referred to it as an unleashing of the powers of the weapons of the spirit. He referred to it as an unleashing of the church militant. He referred to it as a Christian movement. And by Christian movement, he didn't mean to insinuate any kind of imperial claim or to close ranks. He was simply describing the nature of the rank and file of the Montgomery Bus Boycott protesters, and these were Black men and women of the churches of Montgomery. And here he pauses in this address given during a what was called sort of a Congress, an Institute on Nonviolence and Social Change, to reflect on the year. And he says, if you have this in front of you, 458, top paragraph, we have before us the glorious opportunity to inject a new dimension of love into the veins of our civilization. There is still a voice crying out in terms that echo across the generations, saying, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. We might pause even there to scratch our heads and wonder how it came to be that King's vocation as a civil rights minister that he would echo in one of his last great addresses as the calling to the ministry of Jesus Christ, would have become so kind of secularized in our popular kind of public memory and in so much historiography. I think part of the explanation is a very mundane one, and part of the reason is a mundane one, that these documents that we have here in this volume, thanks to the brilliant and tireless work of Dr. Claiborne Carson, who is the director of the King Papers Project at Stanford University, and also the author of my favorite book on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, that would represent, as you know, the student wave of the movement that begins here in Montgomery, that would cluster around the work of Ella Baker and Bob Moses and Jane Stembridge in 1962. That book called In Struggle, it's an excellent, excellent book. That we have these papers, and we have now access to sermons and letters and fragments of sermons that show us in detail the theological sophistication, but also the deep theological structures of King's self-understanding, and I think of his understanding of the movement. This love might well be the salvation of our civilization. This is why I am so impressed with our motto for the week: freedom and justice through love, not through violence, not through hate, no, not even through boycotts, but through love. It is love that as we struggle for freedom in America, we will have to, it is true, sorry, that as we struggle for our freedom in America, we will have to boycott at times. But we must remember as we boycott, that a boycott is not an end within itself. It is merely a means to awaken a sense of shame within the oppressor and challenge his false sense of superiority. But the end, so again, is putting into a kind of narrative framework, or a kind of theological framework, the narrative arc, if you will, of what he understands to be now unfolding. The end is not the boycott. The end is not the protest. The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opposers into friends. It is this type of understanding, goodwill, that would transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love which will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. And if you've ever read King's memoir of the Montgomery movement, a book called Stride Toward Freedom, you'll know that these lofty admonitions to love and this almost kind of sublime rendering of the goal or the end of the movement as redemption, reconciliation, and creation of beloved community are in fact implemented in strategic ways and in, for example, training sessions about how to engage in nonviolent direct action. You will have noted, and I'm going to find this document and send it to you because it's such an extraordinary document. And I compare it, I think of it at times, and I've thought of it at times when in recent years I've been at demonstrations and protests, whether it was downtown Charlottesville on that horrible Saturday in 2017 when it seemed like the gates of hell had opened and these demonic presences were overwhelming the city with their neo-Nazi regalia and their machine guns and their hatred, or whether it was in some kind of living wage campaign or any kind of protest. I thought of this at times when I have felt personally moved to anger, in response to an unjust situation, a perceived injustice that required some kind of collective action. I've heard, my fellow protesters dropping F-bombs, and I have dropped plenty myself. And I, have often thought about just writing an op-ed on maybe a moratorium on the F word at progressive protest. And I thought about King's document, a document that was drafted for preparing men and women and children in these exercises of nonviolent direct action, and they read almost kind of like a monastic rule, and they talk about sort of spiritual preparation and the importance of a kind of inner equanimity and prayer, and they talk about presentation, about dress and manner. So this was all in fact part of the genius, if you will, of the Montgomery story. And so we see here King enumerating or explicating or proclaiming the vision of this emerging new possibility of human social relation and of social and political life in a region shaped by Jim Crow laws and segregationist laws, and in a nation that still did not provide legal protection for African Americans, as the pursuit of the beloved community. So, I know Dr. Aiken will speak about this next week. It's such a beautiful term. It's such a lovely, inviting term. It reminds me at times of an image that my matron saint, Miss Fannie Lou Hamer of Rouville, Mississippi, who was one of the leaders in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, would use when she spoke of the movement as a welcoming table. But let me take a step back from this, as I told you I would, and look at to sort of get a larger perspective on these Montgomery documents in what might be called a confluence of optimisms. I like that term. It comes from a Mennonite theologian who is writing about King and King's vision of nonviolent direct action against the backdrop of American democracy. And he refers to a confluence of optimisms. And what is meant by this is that as King begins to unfold in the company of women and men leadership, the civil rights vision, and to begin to implement it in different ways. And of course, after his move to Atlanta, when he becomes the founding director of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we see the ways in which the beloved community are, the beloved community as a sort of poetic pastoral rendering of the Christian doctrine of the kingdom of God. We find that this vision of the kingdom of God or the beloved community aligning at times with the American, dream. Okay, so this is what this theologian means by naming this confluence of optimisms as kind of a question mark about what the beloved community in fact means. Is the beloved community really only a kind of renaming of the fulfillment of the American dream? I can't remember, I think it might have been Reinhold Niebuhr's biographer who noted that Lyndon Johnson, in launching this ambitious slate of federal social programs in the late 60s, used the term "the Great Society" as a way of translating the term "the beloved community" to something that sounded perhaps more policy driven. But is it the case, here's the question, that Christian hope, however it is articulated here, is not finally used or employed as an opiate, for social protest and the pursuit of social progress. I would, of course, say it's not used as an opiate, but it's used as and not even as necessarily as a stimulant, but simply as a description of what is unfolding. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, King's vision of beloved community rested, nonetheless, fairly comfortably in the arms of a democratic tradition inscribed in the Declaration of Independence and in the US Constitution. Although I would push back on the notion that, or the claim that this emerging new world, this coming new age, the daybreak, in the daybreak of freedom, the coming beloved community, and this almost kind of early Barthian kind of sense of this eruption into these ordinary towns in the South of divine justice. I would push back on the claim that these are but theological kinds of renderings of a primarily political achievement or political aim. First of all, I mean, as an African American born and raised in the culture of Southern segregation, King had every good reason to be cautious, if not pessimistic, about the prospects of civil religion and civic progress. We dare not forget that even in his most optimistic moments, the 1963 "I Have a Dream" speech, giving voice to a land and dreams of a land where people of all races, of all nationalities, of all creeds can live together as brothers and sisters, and the invocation of this welcoming table in South Georgia, where the descendants of slaves and of slave owners sit down together and break bread as kin. The America he spied was a dream as yet unfilled, and in any case, a successful outcome at the federal level, as citizens of the movement observed between the years of the Montgomery protest, 1956, and the passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Civil Rights Act in 1964. These would not diminish, but strengthen the theological case. That is, the case that there may in some way be this kind of alignment or convergence of optimisms between theological hopes and the American project. And yet and I'm going to sort of question that presently, but even if you want to trade on that interpretation of the movement, which many, if not most, historians seem to do at some level, it's still incumbent upon you to understand the theological details and kind of inner logic, if you will, of the civil rights church of the beloved community as it's taking form in these particular campaigns, and as it's being imagining as something altogether different than a hope in the inherent promises of the American project. And it would be better to say, I think, that that for King, this is all kind of coming to this point, that the expectations in the political order were always animated by fundamental theological convictions. And that even in those years of great kind of optimism and a sense of, synergistic kind of the kind of synergistic achievements of the movement's spiritual vision and the federal government's ability to respond and deliver the goods, the perception remained that among the Black church people that the God who has borne the sins of the world on Calvary, and all of this lovely language that we find in sermons throughout the years, and we find indeed even on that first sermon preached, I think it was on the 5th of December 1955, in the opening days of the bus boycott, this language of the great epic of the cross and the great camp meeting, the great campground meeting, all these exquisite kind of renderings of the Gospels kind of inner kind of logic with regard to the refiguration of the self and social relation, that these powers unleashed by this great event, the great epic. Some of this again sounds like language from the early Barth, and I have written, I think in the article that you read, that King cites Barth as much in his student papers, maybe not quite as much as he does Reinhold Niebuhr, and there's and it's not only to offer kind of the familiar criticisms of Barth that were fashionable in American theological circles, and particularly in a place like Boston University in the 1950s, but to applaud aspects of Barth's recovery of the language of divine otherness and transcendence, and the kinds of metaphors that attend the event of revelation not as some emergence of an organic process or the apotheosis of the kind of evolutionary energies of the created order, but as this interruption, this disruption, that the God who has borne the sins of the world in Calvary is the God who is at work in this movement, on the streets of Montgomery, in the nation, and in the world. And so I again think it would be better to say that for King, the expectations for the political order were animated by primarily theological convictions that the movement is part of a story, the dream is part of the story, the beloved community is part of the story of the God of Israel and Jesus Christ, the God of the Bible, who is a God of deliverance and reconciliation. And so King's so-called civil religion was, in this manner, more properly a civil courage of the sort we find Dietrich Bonhoeffer giving name to in his document After 10 Years. It's his hopes for change, his King's hope for change, were not then based on the notion that God has chosen America as his favorite people, the trope of American exceptionalism in its various forms. Even though I think there's some hints of that in King's earlier writings, but his hopes for change were based not on this idea that America is inherently moving towards ever more just and democratic forms of social existence, but in fact, hopes that are fundamentally eschatological in nature. And so, while it may be the case that King's eschatological hopes are more intensified rhetorically late. So, we have Richard Lisher, professor at Duke, who wrote this beautiful kind of groundbreaking book called The Preacher King that seeks to develop a kind of theological account of King, primarily on the basis of his sermons. We find Professor Lisher saying that sometime after 1965, 66, I think this is when he marks this, King will no longer use the phrase the beloved community, but will instead use the more explicitly theological term, the kingdom of God. And what Lisher means by that is that there is an eschatological intensification in the later King. So when this confluence of optimism is ruptured after, let's say, 1965, as the storm clouds of Vietnam begin to cast their gloom over the American soulscape, as the movement itself becomes fractured in various ways, as Southern segregation appears to have been much more insidious than could be legislated away, as Northern liberals discover to their dismay, that the problem of racism in America could not be resolved by simply ending Southern segregation, that, as Stokely Carmichael would put it, racism is as American as apple pie. You find this eschatological intensification in King's writings. So then, when we turn to an address given 1 year to the date of Dr. King's murder in Memphis, I speak of the April 4th, 1967 address, sometimes called a time to break silence, from Riverside Church in New York. It's an address that I would love for you to listen to, kind of in as you hopefully listen and watch some of the offerings from the Montgomery years on YouTube and various streaming services, because it's a study in contrast, but in my estimation, it's simply a development or an explication or an application of foundational theological claims and convictions that were present in Montgomery in view of this rupture between the vision of beloved community and the idea of America and the notion of some or the confidence at some level that there can be an alignment of those two hopes, the theological and the social hope. So King, and just if I can fast forward to that speech in 1967, because I think it's really important as we read the writings of 1956, King appears to us no longer as a pastor speaking against injustice on behalf of a nation whose spiritual and philosophical origins enable continual progress at the political level. But he is speaking, if you will, as a prophet. At least this is what Rabbi Abraham Heschel, who was in the audience that night, believed, against an inherently unjust nation, inherently unjust for reasons that were enumerated as early as a student paper in Boston University, when we find Reinhold Niebuhr, Martin King applauding the moves that Reinhold Niebuhr made in Moral Man and Immoral Society, and in particular, his reminder spoken against the backdrop of kind of 19th century Protestant liberal optimism about the achievement of the human good. King's harsh reminders about the inescapable sinfulness and egoism and pride and narcissism that exist in the individual, but in collective and tractable forms in institutions and principalities and powers. Going back for a minute, okay, I just need to take a 2 or 3 minute break, okay? Yeah, so let me just try to conclude some of these remarks in the second half of my time with you. One way of putting it is one way of kind of thinking about King's this question of what kind of theologian is King? Where what is his theological orientation? Is he what are the theological? How does one understand King theologically? Where do we locate him in the story of modern theology? Until recently, he was not located at all in the story of modern theology. He was taught in some Christian ethics courses, but largely left out of the theological canon. I think in some places that's, I think in many instances that's still the case, and it's regrettable. I think it's also kind of lazy. King, the question of King's theological orientation requires us to do more as theologians and scholars of religion than perhaps, at least on the theological side, we're kind of comfortable doing in our training, and that is to understand an idea against the larger kind of constellation of realities and factors than the written canon or the body of interpretive writing, which I have called, of course, the enterprise of lived theology. What would it mean to look, for example, as the civil rights movement from 1955 until 1964 as and their reasons for that particular chronology as a theological text. You of course use the spoken word, and there is much in the archives now that gives us exquisite detail on the way in which both trained theologians, seminarians, and church people, in their own kind of sometimes ingenious synthetic ways, are thinking and navigating theologically the realities of white oppression and of the movement. But it requires ethnography. It requires oral history, the tools of ethnography and oral history, rolling up your sleeves and going into archives. All this is very exciting work, but it's not really the work that kind of preoccupies, theological method as I studied it, and many of you have studied it as well. But Michael Eric Dyson, whose popular work some of you may have read, in his book on King, it was written 15, 20 years ago, I can get the title. I think, as King understood, Black religion is constantly in tension with all political systems, even those favored by the church's prophetic brigade. But the radical remnant, this is still Dyson, tirelessly works to make politics reflect the justice that prevails in God's kingdom. And so this, I think, points to that notion that even in this period, when there seems to be a kind of a nice reciprocity between the hopes evoked in the congregations and at the level of the local movement story and the delivery on those hopes by the federal government, Black Southerners, having been raised into the iron-hard rule of Jim Crow, knew that there was this inevitable and inescapable tension between the images and imagery and energies and convictions of the church and those of the political system. So King, in this sense, did not so much strike a balance between what Dyson calls prophetic religion and American destiny, as imagine democratic possibilities from the perspective of biblical hope. So this one way of telling the story of King, that there's this sort of movement from identification to rage, identification of the beloved community with the American story, to rage against the machine, if you will. Some of you may have been to their shows 20 years ago and lost a little of your hearing. But this is a sort of an easy, all too easy kind of narrative perspective, that he moved from identification to rage. He never identified the movement's vision with any sort of American exceptionalism. And do I need to remind us that I Have a Dream and was delivered the same summer, or within the same 6-month period, as Eulogy for the Martyred Children, that both were delivered within this, I think it's a 3-month time frame, that would seem to make it almost perverse to impose upon King some notion that there was this inherent spirit at work in the American project, or in history as an evolutionary development, that would lead toward the achievement of beloved community. The dream that my four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by, the color of their skin, but the content of their character, is dreamed to and with a nation where four little girls are killed in Sunday school and their Sunday school rooms in Birmingham in 1963, and one of the most vicious, heinous crimes, as King said, ever perpetrated against humanity. And yet the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65 do still illuminate this confluence of optimisms, all right? Let's fast forward one more time to that speech in 1967. King is saying, a few years ago, there was a shining moment in Americans' concern for the poor and the downtrodden. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments, there were hopes, there were new beginnings. Then came the buildup in Vietnam, and I watched the program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, as long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destruction suction tube. SCLC's motto, the organization that King founded, Redeeming the Soul of America, made clear America's need for redemption and raised the question of what might it even mean to redeem the soul of a nation. But in the Riverside sermon, some 9 years later, King worries that the soul of America is beyond redemption. It may be beyond redemption. It may have become totally poisoned, he says. National redemption is certainly not to be identified with ending legal segregation. Looking on the world, King adds in that remarkable speech, from the perspective of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ, King calls for the nation to become a servant nation among the poor of the world. The Church of the Outcasts of America, which Bonhoeffer had glimpsed in 1931, was in profound way the church that is home to these revival-like mass meetings and prayer services and singing and testifying and organizing of 1956. But the idea that the nation now must be judged against the peculiar mandates of the church militant, I think is both shocking in its delivery here, but it's also one that is articulated decisively in Montgomery. Okay, nothing less is needed than a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than any on programs of social uplift is a nation approaching spiritual death. King calls America to a maturity that it may not be able to achieve. So we see here the eschatological dimension intensifying when religious hope and social progress no longer coalesce, but they collide. Whither hope? I would submit to you that Montgomery establishes the theological foundation, that hope was always a hope peculiar to the church in its inner logic and in its convictions. What happens, and if I could just kind of enumerate some questions at this point that hopefully you can turn back into your discussion period. What happens to theological hopes when concrete achievements awakened by those hopes become distant or even muddled? May it possibly turn out to be the case that the movement's confidence, or let's just say those years in which there was this convergence of optimisms between the religious hope and social progress, that may be the case that those were never really anything more than a kind of philosophical utilitarianism. Does not this confidence between the awakening vision of the beloved community and the hope for the American story, and does not this confidence and this passing, although more than ephemeral coincidence between Christian hope and the American dream, does it have the effect of permitting or even fostering a manipulation or an exploitation that trusts too much in the rightness of one's own perspective? And then finally, what about suffering? What about redemptive suffering? What about the commitment to the possibilities, to the social, real concrete social repercussions of redemptive suffering? Has suffering made sense only as part of a larger utilitarian transaction, or again, is suffering inherent to, is suffering finally and essentially named by the inner logic of this biblical narrative of the God revealing God's self in Israel and Jesus Christ? I think that's the case for King. Whatever be the detailed articulation of the relationship, suffering had always, in some ways, made sense as part of the promise of progress. So I believe that in response to these questions, does, and then of course the final question in what I have here is a 2-page series of questions. Does not this awakening to the disruption, the rupture, the breaking apart, the chastening of this confluence of optimisms, does it finally not give way to despair, right? And to a kind of paralysis of spirit and a kind of disillusionment, and that may express itself in rage, or it may express itself in quietism and withdrawal. In fact, I believe that King's own restatement, his own way of thinking about the movement, drew regularly and pervasively from an indisputable Christological basis, and that that kind of cruciform shape of the movement is observable in these letters and papers from Montgomery. There are more things more points that I could make here, but I do think this is an appropriate time and past appropriate time to turn now back directly to the Montgomery story. So if we could just take a 2 or 3 minute break, and then when we return, if this is okay with you, Guy, I'll just take us up until 5 o'clock, at which point y'all can have a coffee break and then really dig into the text. But I hope these comments are helpful, perhaps somewhat ponderous, but nonetheless give you sort of a sense of the tensions in trying to understand King as theologian. But I think finally, the appeal to the documentary evidence that we have here as an illumination that for King, the political was always understood primarily through the lens of the theological. And so we don't really need, apologies to my former colleague, John Milbank, and the radical orthodoxy movement to take us to this point, but we can find such robust theological claims in the civil rights movement if we're willing to dig deep. Okay, I'll be back in a second. Did I have you read this document called "When Peace Becomes Obnoxious"? Sermon delivered on March 1956, page 207. No. It's one of these fragments of a sermon. I just happened to open my book to it in this moment, and he writes that now let us hasten to say that this is not a concession to or justification for physical violence. I can see no moral justification for that. I believe absolutely and positively that violence is self-defeating. War is devastating, and we know now that if we continue to use these weapons of destruction, our civilization would be plunged across the abyss of destruction. Speaking in the midst of Cold War America, of course. But then it kind of redounds to the moment at hand. However, this is a type of war that every Christian is involved in. The type of war, he's using he's trying to kind of deconstruct the language of warfare and put it in the context of a nonviolent campaign to end segregated seating on city buses. It's a spiritual war. It is a war of ideas. Every true Christian is a fighting pacifist. Did you read that? Have you read that line before, Guy? I'd love to hear your take on that. Every true Christian is a fighting pacifist. I mean, he's trading here, of course, on the distinction between nonviolent direct action and non-resistance, which I presume you'll talk about next week, in a very profound passage that has been often misunderstood. This is the same passage that Dr. King quotes on the night in late January of 1956 that his home is bombed. You may recall that story from the Montgomery Bus Boycott. He says, "Think not that I am come to bring peace. I come not to bring peace, but a sword." Certainly, he is not saying, this is King talking about Jesus. He is not saying that he comes not to bring peace in the higher sense. What he is saying is, I come not to bring this peace of escapism, this peace that fails to confront the real issues of life, the peace that makes for stagnant complacency. I come to bring a sword, not a physical sword, King says. Whenever I come, a conflict is precipitated, King, between the old and the new, between justice and injustice, between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. I come to declare war over injustice. I come to declare war on evil. Peace is not merely the absence of some negative force, war, tension, confusion, but is the presence of some positive force, justice, goodwill, the power of the kingdom of God. I had a long talk with a man the other day about this bus situation. He discussed the peace being destroyed in the community, the destroying of good race relations. So this is a trope in sort of segregation South, and you see this on newsreels, and you see it in documentary films when white politicians and civic leaders are asked about this unjust system of Jim Crow laws. They almost always begin kind of articulating this line, the story on how good race relations are in the South, and that our Negroes are happy with their lot, and that this movement in Montgomery, which is really at this point about nothing more than changing seating laws on municipal buses in this one city, has disrupted this kind of equanimous, that's not the right word, this kind of social equilibrium and the equanimity of relations between blacks and whites. But I agree that it is more tension now. But peace, Dr. King says, is not merely the absence of this tension, but the presence of justice. And even if we didn't have this tension, we still wouldn't have positive peace. Yes, it is true that the Negro accepts his place, accepts exploitation and injustice. It is true that if the Negro accepts his place, there will be peace, but it would be a peace boiled down to stagnant complacency. It would be a peace boiled down to deadening passivity. And if this is peace, I don't want peace. If peace means accepting second-class citizenship, I don't want it. If peace means keeping my mouth shut in the midst of injustice and evil, I don't want it. If peace means being complacently adjusted to a deadening status quo, I don't want peace. If peace means a willingness to be exploited economically, dominated politically, humiliated, and segregated, I don't want it. So in a passive, nonviolent manner, we must revolt against this kind of accommodating peace, this peace of the status quo. Jesus says in substance, I will not be content until justice, goodwill, brotherhood, love, yes, the kingdom of God are established upon the earth. This is real peace, a peace embodied with the presence of positive good. What is the peace that the Montgomery movement is after? What is the end of the protests? The end is not the boycott. We need to boycott. We need to protest, and we need to wage campaigns against the material conditions of injustice. But the inner peace that gives shape and that gives energy to this vision of beloved community is a result of doing God's will, comes as a result of doing God's will. Now, you may know, and I'll just say a few final words before discussion, that this moment, this document here, and pretty much everything preached and spoken from February of 1956 until that address given at Holt Street Baptist Church, from which we read earlier in the day, that it represents a very different king theologically than the one who was called and answered the call to be the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in the summer of 1954. I mean, the summer of 1954 is a summer of like dramatic contrast, right? I mean, we have Brown versus Ford being decided by the United States Supreme Court, and we find Martin Luther King Jr. just passed his comprehensive exams at Boston University, taking a pastorate at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, not because he had any interest in organizing a civil rights campaign or really any interest in social protest, but in fact because he was a prodigy of he was exceedingly gifted mind. He was, I think, a freshman at Morehouse College when he was 15 or 16. He was trained in the same sort of canon of philosophical theology that we've already immersed ourselves in with Bonhoeffer and to a certain extent with Niebuhr. He's a prodigy. He's a homiletical prodigy, let us say. I mean, he's gifted beyond measure in rhetoric and in kind of pastoral commerce. And he accepts this position at Dexter Avenue because it's a pretty darn good salary. And it's an educated congregation. King tells us, doesn't he, in one of these documents we read today, I think it's a wonderful little slip. It's not really, I don't know if it's a slip, but it's sort of a really fascinating glimpse into the kind of men and women who were part of this, early, the earliest mass meetings that formed the Montgomery Bus Boycott, when King says, I've never ridden a bus in Montgomery. Most of the church people arrived at Dexter Avenue in their, late model, sedans, and they wore, a kind of, cloud of sartorial splendor, and King was himself a man of deliberate refinement. I have to tell you a funny story, if you will, but it was told to me by one of my first doctoral students here at the University of Virginia. I was in my office. I don't know, hadn't moved into Gibson Hall yet, and we were still like in a trailer, some mobile trailers that were next to the Navy ROTC building or something like that. But this this slightly older than normal than your typical grad student in his 20s came into my office and introduced himself as a new doctoral student. His name, it said, was Richard Wills, and he was coming directly from a church in Boston. But he told me that he had been the senior pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama for 7 or 8 years, at which point I went speechless. I felt like I should fall down on the floor and, ask as much as, an old Baptist boy like me can imagine apostolic succession. It would be being blessed by a former pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And he ended up writing his doctoral dissertation on the idea of the image of God in King's thought, which was a really interesting kind of thematic within which to begin this work, which in the early aughts was just pioneer work of developing a more robust, richly layered interpretation of King as theologian. It's a book that Oxford University Press published called Martin Luther King Jr. and the Idea of the Image of God, if I'm not mistaken, Richard Wills. But he told me a story, and this gives you a glimpse into the kind of parish that King pastored. Richard said that after he'd been there as a pastor for a couple of weeks, one Sunday morning after church, one of the members of the Women's Church Guild, who was, I think, a professor, many of the members of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, which is right downtown Montgomery, right across from the federal judiciary at the time. You can see the state capitol. so it's right down in the heart of power. I mean, if God were to kind of set a stage for some quite dramatic, so quite vivid theological drama, this would be an appropriate setting. And so many of the parishioners were, professors, Alabama State, and many of the organizers who would come were, professionals. But anyway, Richard said, and this is in the 1990s, he said, a churchwoman approached me one Sunday morning after church and to say to me, Reverend Wills, are you not yet acquainted with any dry cleaners in Montgomery? Richard said, ma'am, I wasn't quite sure where she was going. And where she was going was that she was concerned that his shirt under his suit was not properly starched and pressed. And it had kind of a wrinkled appearance. And this was not befitting a pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. So he said, yeah, ma'am, I understand and I'll take care of this. So a few weeks passed, and early one morning, before the family had left, Richard and his family had left their home for church, there's a knock at the door. And it was this woman from the church guild, and she was standing at the door with another member of the church guild, and with an ironing board in her hand, and an iron, and a can of starch. And she insisted that she show the pastor and his wife and his family, if they can't find a dry cleaner, at least how to properly press and starch a shirt before you put it on and ascend to the pulpit of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. All of this is to say, Dexter Avenue was not looking for someone to come to, create any kind of a social movement. They had recently parted ways with the extraordinary Vernon Johns, who was a pastor from Virginia, who was actually a brilliant and erudite scholar of classics, studied at Oberlin, Oberlin College, but who was also a bit of a prankster, and who would, who kind of, honestly, he would, part of his pastorate involved teasing and kind of provoking the silk stocking Dexter crowd with images and with kind of these little pieces of performance art that that tried to break through their pretension and remind them of their essential historical connection to poor African Americans. And one Sunday morning, he set up a vegetable stand on the front of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and came to church in some old beat up overalls of the sort you would find a black farmer wearing, and a straw hat, and he was selling tomatoes and corn, and it just drove the parish crazy. And he really wanted to contest the social order, but he was eventually, I think, fired a number of times. And if you could possibly get your hands on Taylor Branch's, the first volume of Taylor Branch's trilogy on America during the King years, it opens with this almost this cinematic kind of account of Vernon Johns. In fact, a cadre of women and men, Edie Nixon, Joanne Robinson, who wrote a really wonderful book called The Women Who Founded the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and Rosa Parks and others who kind of spirited King into the movement when he accepted the invitation by Ralph Abernathy, the day of Rosa Parks' extraordinary act of civil courage, King said, "Yeah, okay, I'll be your spokesperson, but only if this thing lasts 24 hours, and well, it didn't last 24 hours. A few days later, King, under pressure from these folks who had appointed him to be the spokesperson of this newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association, pressured him to put together some kind of list of demands, okay? And the list that King came back with was so tepid that, not even the NAACP, which was hardly a militant organization, supported. King's initial list of demands did not even include challenging the law that created these divided sections on Montgomery Bus Boycott, on Montgomery City buses. It governed his list of demands initially was, let's get some more polite ask bus drivers to be more polite. Let's get more stops in Black neighborhoods and the like. So, the question is, if we're reading the Montgomery Bus Boycott as a theological text, and moreover as a text that also shows us how King is formed theologically, what happened? Remember that question we asked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer after New York? Like, he goes and returns to Germany and he has these new convictions about all manner of things. Well, what happened in Montgomery to move King from this reluctant, prophet to one who, in the spring of 1956, is fast becoming one of the South's, the nation's, the world's most articulate spokesperson for nonviolent direct action. Someone who, on that first day of the movement still would not have called himself a pacifist, really but didn't know that much about nonviolent direct action, had not really thought about the church militant and its acts of obedience and costly grace, if you will, in the social order. So that may be sort of an interesting way to frame the discussion that follows. All right, I hope this was helpful, and I wish I could be there, but peace, y'all. Bye, Ian.
Okay.